Right. So you can have ask any questions.
Yeah. Since one, too bad that there are not many people, but on the other hand, that we can ask more questions.
Right.
So, so I've been trying to follow Ghamidi Sahib in very traditional, conventional Islam, where the most of the ulama is preaching the same thing. They have different perspective about the firqa or group, but they are saying the same thing, that pan-Islamism, killing non-Muslims,
Right.
and the emotionality of it, not intellectual part of it. How do we intellectually provoke people to think different? And that's what I'm thinking, that why Ahmed Sahib came up with a different approach to the Quran 1400 some years later, versus the people been preaching.
Right.
I know that Farai Sahib have a different view, and that he sees as him as a teacher. Most people don't even know who Farai Sahib was or is, but except for the people who know him from that background. So idea is that how do I convince people to think different when they have been, it's in their genes.
Right.
It's in their genes.
Right.
And
Right.
not thinking intellectually, but just following what the alim or sheikh is saying.
Right. So actually, this is a cultural thing with which we have brought up with, that religion is something that you cannot question or cannot argue. And I think one of the reasons for this is that it has been a very long time since the Quran has not remained an object of our direct guidance. So we learn by heart the Quran, we memorize the Quran, but it has got very little to do with our own lives. Normally, not normally, I would say, if you have knowledge of our seminaries, our madrasas, the topmost position of a madrasa is Shaykh al-Hadith. You will not find a Shaykh al-Quran in any madrasa. So the reason, that I was implying, is that in our seminaries, more stress is given to Hadith, fiqh, and history rather than the Quran itself. The Quran is generally, this is also a recent induction in which the Quran is revised through a translation. Otherwise, in a couple of years in which you just remember the Quran, you memorize the Quran, and maybe go through a translation of the Quran. That is all that is done in our madrasa. So they are more trained in fiqh, in polemical debates, and in hadith literature. And as I said, it reflects it gravely reflects on the fact that the person who is the teacher, he's the supreme teacher of the madrasa, is called as Shaykh al-Hadith. So unfortunately, in our seminaries, the Quran does not occupy that place, and it's just learned by heart. In our normal lives, all of us sitting here, we know that the Quran has even lesser a place. It's just brought out when people die, and you just read the Quran to give them that reward, transfer the reward for your own recitation. So our own relationship with the Quran is so weak. I'm talking about in general, that we have virtually drawn away from the message of the Quran. Because you see, if you read the Quran with the translation, which I encourage very much our younger generation, you cannot stop but thinking, reflecting, critically examining ideas. Because the Quran, on every third occasion, says, use your intellect, use your brains. It says, on one occasion, it says, "Law kunna nasma'u aw naqilu, ma kunna fi ashabis sa'ir," which is a dialogue which will take place on the day of judgment. And people who would go to hell, they would say that had we used our intellect or listened in a proper way, we would not have ended up here, telling us or signifying the fact that how important intellect is. So if had we been directly connected to the Quran and not with our traditional clergy, we would have been directly told by God that use your minds, use your intellect, use your thinking. And because this doesn't happen, because generally very few, there are exceptions, but there are very few instances in which young minds or even adults go through this understanding of the Quran. And for them, the Quran is something which is brought out just in Ramadan, in which they just read through the Quran without even understanding it. And they say that, well, I finished the Quran thrice or 4 times or 5 times. What good is it if you don't understand the Quran? So I think this is this patchy or sketchy relationship with the Quran, which accounts for what you have just referred to, that people have become dogmatic. You see, had they learned the Quran, had they understood the Quran, the Quran is anti-dogmatic. The Quran says that you understand things. Don't force those ideas on other people or on your own self. It would have been that people would have critically evaluated concepts if they had read the Quran. But because the Quran has not been read the way it should be, people have become dogmatic. And they think that once something has been told to you by your parents, by your society, by your elders, it is unchallengeable. And whether you find it in the Quran or not, because it is in our culture or it is in our genes, as you said, or in our blood, you think that it is something which is very sacred. So I would say that we have to revise and totally overhaul our approach towards the Quran, in which understanding the Quran is a target of each one of us. And I go a step ahead in this as well. I say, yes, something, I mean, what you call reading a translation is always possible, because you just pick up an English or an Urdu or a translation which in the language that we know. One step further that I would request and also implore all of you, and of course whoever I meet, I do so, is that learning Quranic Arabic is just about a year's, I mean, maybe 6 to 8 months of effort of 1 hour per day. If you're able to take out 1 hour per day for, let's say, 6 to 8 months in a very concerted way, you will be in a position to understand the Quran directly without, I mean, needing a translation. And I can tell you the impact the Quran has on you, if you can understand it directly, is huge. I mean, it's incomparable. So imagine the Quran being read in the prayer and you understanding it directly, or you reading the Quran and understanding it directly. Because you see, God is speaking. I mean, it's not me or you, it's God who's speaking. So when you understand God directly from God's words, it has a huge impact. Not only your intellect is I mean, enlightened, your own moral being is lit up. So I think that this is one area in which we seriously lack. But today, Alhamdulillah, especially in this COVID era, they have become so many, people have made so many apps in which you can learn Quranic Arabic. I mean, you learn Quranic Arabic at home through your phones, maybe when you're sitting in your offices, have vacant time. So it's just a question of an hour a day. And I can tell you that it's going to make a huge difference in our lives. And the dogmatic thinking that you're talking about would be replaced by reasonable and argumentative thinking.
One more question, and then I'll leave it to the other people to ask questions. So the concept that is new also for me, the Imam and Hujjat,
Right.
Then there's lesser degree of the Judgment
Yeah.
Day and the time of Prophet. When you read in Quran, you don't get that. I mean, at least I don't. And even if I read the translation or traditional tafsir.
Right.
So I don't get how did Ghamidi Sahib came
Right.
up with this, or did some people come up with this before?
So you see, one of the characteristics of the Quran is that it does not discuss things by, for example, creating a heading or bringing all verses of the same topic under one verse. To give you an example, if it discusses Tawheed, it's not going to discuss Tawheed in one surah. It's like discussing one part of Tawheed in Surah Baqarah, then something else in some other part of the Quran. So the approach of the Quran is that it does not discuss one topic at one place. It will discuss one part of a topic at one place, and it is scattered all over the Quran. And to make a complete picture, what you need to do is you pick out all the verses which deal with a particular topic. So, for example, if you would like to study about what happened at the time of creation between Adam and Satan and the whole incident, it's not that you just read one part, which is Surah Baqarah, verse 40 onwards. You read 7 or 8 places in which this incident is mentioned in various other ways. In a similar way, this topic of Itmam al-Hujjah, by the way, the word Itmam al-Hujjah means the delivery of truth or the communication of truth in such a ultimate way that person is left with no excuse. Hujjah means excuse. I mean, it means ultimate argument, and Itmam means that it is delivered in such a way that you are left with no excuse, like conclusively conveying the truth. So that is the word Itmam al-Hujjah. So it has, again, like Tawheed or maybe like Risala or other topics of the Quran, once again, Itmam al-Hujjah is a concept that has not been discussed with a heading in a particular surah and all the verses are there in one place. In fact, it is such a strong motive of the Quran that you'll find it if you just open your eye. I mean, you get that understanding that is something which is present in almost every surah of the Quran, and that is that the Quran tells you about those ancient nations which were destroyed by earthquakes, by cyclones, the Ad, the Samud, the people of Lot. Isn't that? You remember all these nations being mentioned copiously in the Quran. If you go behind each of these incidents, you'll find that the Prophet of God comes to them. He tells them that I'm going to deliver you the truth. If you deny me, then you'll be punished in this world. And this punishment is something which is God going to take care of you. We are going to be sifted out from you. We are going to be saved by God, but you're going to be destroyed. So all these ancient nations whose mention we find in the Quran, they are governed by this law that people who intentionally deny the truth, they are destroyed in this world. And every time you read through these stories, you'll find verses like "Min ba'di ma tabayyana lahumul haqq," that they denied, or "Kafaru min ba'di ma arafu," they denied in spite of the fact that they were absolutely clear that it was the truth. So one of the biggest indications of this law are those mentions of these ancient nations which were destroyed. But other than that, you'll find a lot of verses, I mean, a lot of surahs of the Quran being dedicated to this law. Thus, for example, if you study Surah Mujadala, near the end of that, you'll find the law of these messengers, regarding these messengers being written down very clearly. It says, Kataballahu la aghlibanna ana wa rusuli, that it has been written in the Quran that my messengers are bound to prevail in this world, because they're going to destroy their enemies if they don't accept their message. And then at another place in Surah Yunus it says, "Likulli ummatin rasul." For every ummah there is a rasul. فَإِذَا جَاءَ رَسُولُهُمْ قُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ. Once their messenger comes to them, their fate is decided in this world, and there's no injustice is done to them. So you see, these verses and these stories of the ancient nations are mentioned, scattered in the Quran. And the first person to point out this law was, in fact, Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi in his tafsir. So it was perfected later on by Amin Hasan Islahi, and then further presented by Ustaz Ghamidi. But the credit goes to Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi for pinpointing the fact that we have to find out the reason why these ancient nations were destroyed in this world. Why is it that we are not being destroyed? Remember, it was only the nations of the messengers who were destroyed. After all, we are also nations of a messenger, but we are not living in the era of the messenger. So he made this distinction that people who live in the era of the messengers, they are delivered the truth to the ultimate extent. And God continues to tell them that if you misbehave, if you deny, yes, you'll be given certain time. You'll be given a lot of period. If you have questions, our messenger will answer them. But once you take up arrogance and once you are convinced of the truth and you still would not deny, I mean, you still persist in your denial, then you'll be taken to task in this world. And my own elements of nature, like these winds and these tempests, are going to destroy you. So it is here that if you read those accounts carefully of those previous nations, that you'll become convinced that this law, the more it is in the Quran, the farther away we are from it.
So the Khulafa Rashidin did not understand that, and they continue to go for pan-Islamism at that time?
No, the Khulafa Rashidin absolutely understood it, and they stopped short of that. So, for example, they stopped attacking or did not cross the borders from the countries to which the Prophet has sent those letters for preaching them, inviting them. And by the way, he did this in the 6th Hijrah, and he gave them time, sufficient time, 7 years, that they could have come to him and argued with him, etc. So once those 12 countries were crossed, I mean, they had been conquered. There is this description in history that there were soldiers who tried to cross that border, and it was in the time of one of the caliphs, I think it was Umar, and one of his very important soldiers stopped these people, the head of the soldiers, that you should not cross this border because we are not authorized to go beyond this point. So this is the area which was demarcated by the Prophet of God, and we cannot step beyond that area. But what you can say is that after the Khulafai Rashidun, or maybe the 5th or 6th generation, that this law became blurred. And instead of making this distinction that this was the prerogative of the Sahaba who did this in continuation with the Prophet, we are not authorized to do it. So with the departure of the last Sahabi, or the state of the Sahaba, this had to stop. But unfortunately, such was the momentum of this, and such perhaps was the understanding, that our later people thought that this is a law which is something that we too have to follow and attack the rest of the world. So you know that.
The Arab world, does it know this concept, or
They don't. If you're talking about today's Arab world,
Yes.
they don't, because they follow the traditional thought. Not only the Arab world, but almost all Muslim clergy, including Al-Azhar, including, you to pick up Iran, you pick up Afghanistan, you pick up any Muslim seminary, they are taught this message that they have to conquer the world, because the Sahaba were given this mission, and in pursuance of the Sahaba, you too have this mission to conquer the rest of the world. And today, if you're not being able to do this, then all that you need to do is prepare yourself as much as possible, gather your resources, and one day it will come that you'll be strong enough to attack the rest of the world.
That can end the terrorism if that concept is understood.
Yes, if that concept is understood, terrorism, it meets its fate. And you can easily explain these harsh verses. And let me go a step even further and explain to you that even in the Torah or the Old Testament, you'll find the same harsh verses, signifying the fact that the scripture is teaching us the same thing. The Quran and the Torah, the same thing, because you see, the Torah was also revealed to Moses, and he was a messenger of God. So it was, I mean, exactly the same directives which were given to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam were given to Moses as well, because he's also a messenger of God, and he too was required to create a lesser day of judgment, so to speak, in his own era. So a lot of verses in the Torah which are again not being properly, I mean, at times understood by our Jewish community. Maybe we could be able to make sense to them by telling us that this is a law which is mentioned in the Torah, it's mentioned in the Injil as well, in the New Testament, and also in the final testament, which is the Quran. And all three of these books are in complete harmony, and they tell us of a certain law which is only invoked in the era of your messengers. So I think this is one thing that can take us even to explain certain harsh verses of the Old Testament as well.